Well, we're really happy to have the opportunity to present our work in progress, and also want to thank the Bedrosian Center for this grant, which was very well timed because we just moved to Sacramento about 1.5 years ago, and we are exploring and learning a lot about state government and thinking about how to reorient our research project, or research program, to be more focused at the state level. The folks who gave us the funding will notice that we've actually retitled the presentation from the original grant proposal and from what you probably saw as the invitation. And that's because as we did the work on learning about agency performance management efforts at the state level, our thinking has evolved. So we went into this project looking at what state departments were doing to try to reform or to try to institute performance management approaches, and we were thinking of it as sort of a design fit question. So if you look at the different kinds of capacity constraints and missions of the departments, what sort of performance management approach fits best? And that was kind of our hypothesis or our research question going in. And as we started working on this more, we started thinking of it more from a process standpoint and implementation standpoint, really, trying to think about what happens when you have a state that is arguably hostile to performance management and departments that are actually trying to institute performance reforms that are evidence-based. What do they do? How do they go about it? And kind of ended up with, I think, channeling one of my former professors, Aaron Wildofsky, in thinking about this as an exercise in incrementalism. So our driving question is how performance management initiatives might improve state government in the absence of what people would recognize as the kinds of supports that one expects to have in a successful performance management system. And I like to repeat a joke that I started hearing a lot when I moved to Sacramento. You may have heard it. Why aren't Californians afraid of earthquakes? Because the state's already broken. So this presents really a reform paradox, because there's a need to improve management within the state, and the general approach, often in the management literature, is around managing for results, bringing evidence to bear, performance management reform, which we will define shortly. But at the same time, what we see in California is that many of the preconditions that are necessary for successful performance management aren't in place. So California is a microcosm of the national landscape in the political polarization that characterizes our coastal and central populations. These play out in the legislature, much as in Congress, and term limits have further destabilized and hollowed out legislative expertise. We have an incredibly complex intergovernmental structure with a tremendous amount of delegation to local government, so that you have attenuated service relationships that are very hard to evaluate. And then on top of that, the state has been a state of chronic structural imbalance for a decade or so. So Don Moynihan has done a lot of work on performance management, and Moynihan and Ingraham had a 2003 paper on performance management, where they did a scorecard on state performance management based on largely on review of state websites, and they actually gave California a C-. Now, I like to note that a C- won't earn credit in any of our graduate master's programs. On the other hand, as Chris and I have gotten into this project, we actually want to accuse Moynihan and Ingraham of grade inflation at the state level. So I think it's not surprising that California, at least from what as we will discuss, has struggled on the performance front, leaving departmental managers who want to manage effectively with kind of a serious dilemma. At the same time, when we arrived in Sacramento, we learned about a kind of mid-level performance management movement that's being led by the Little Hoover Commission, with a lot of, and quite a few departments actually experimenting with performance management, and a sort of, you could think of it almost as a support group for performance management that meets at our center. And so that was really, we became very interested in these mid-level management of efforts to institute performance management, and that was really the impetus for our project. So we're looking at California and focusing on these mid-level departmental reforms. So what do we mean by performance management? It's a general umbrella term as you read the literature. People like to use the term. They mean very many different things. Lots of different approaches fall under the general rubric. And these can include both performance measurement and performance management, frequently used interchangeably, managing for results. Performance-based budgeting has frequently fallen under the rubric of performance management. And then what I like to call fill-in-the-blank stat. So you know, I'm sure that Howard, as an expert on police, knows a lot about comp stat. And those of you who are LA folks know that Bill Bratton was instrumental in bringing computer statistics to bear in trying to improve initially police performance and then ultimately other kinds of primarily urban types of service delivery. It was sort of a development from a stick a pin in the map approach to trying to identify problems to a more sophisticated GIS data management exercise, and has been used in many cities. Here in LA was credited with the decline in crime that we've seen, and also has been implemented at the state level. For example, the state of Maryland has a pretty well-known CompStat program. What I like to say when we're talking about performance management, we're going to sort of leave performance-based budgeting aside for the moment, but we're going to talk about it primarily based on the commonalities of all these approaches, which is that they involve the collection of evidence, which I define as data that has meaning, not just data, but evidence that has data that has meaning, that is then looped back into the management of the organization to track and improve processes, outcomes, and ultimately efficiency. And as part of efficiency, I include effectiveness. And so that's the focus that we're going to use. And actually, performance initiatives really have they've been this attempt towards these kinds of performance initiatives really dates back even to the 1940s, when the Hoover Commission advocated for a performance budget that measured outcomes as opposed to line item purchases. And a lot of the performance initiatives that one sees and a lot of the state performance initiatives, as Chris will discuss, have actually been around budgeting, planning, programming, budgeting systems. So Johnson essentially put into place the 1949 Hoover Commission proposal for a planning, programming, budgeting system. This essentially became the basis of an entire cottage industry attacking comprehensive rational budgeting, of course led by, again, my colleague Aaron Wildovsky with his book Politics of the Budgetary Process. Which essentially was both a positive defense of incrementalism in budgeting in the sense that arguing that this is what we see, and also a normative defense, this is what we can do. And then we see the Nixon era had the management by objectives proposal, which was, again, trying to link stated objectives to budget requests and to hold agency heads responsible for achieving agreed upon outcomes and outputs. So that was both had a budgetary and a managerial focus. And and then we had Clinton with the Government Performance and Results Act. And then finally, Bush had a program assessment rating tool, which was part of his presidential management agenda. And I hope that at some point Raphael can speak to us about his perceptions of the Obama era approach to performance management. We were trying to use this as context, federal context, to talk about this and then move it down to the state level. So we haven't really looked at that as closely, but my sense of it from my initial reading is that it's less of kind of cute catchphrase that has, managing by objectives or, actually sort of one single attempt at this is my agenda, I'm giving it a cute name, and this is how I'm going to do it, and more of a dispersed approach to program evaluation and transparency in particular programs. That's what I seem to have read, and if I'm wrong, I'd love to hear Raphael provide some corrective comments. So let me just say before I turn things over to Chris that to put California's troubles in context, these have not been uniformly successful at the federal level. And so I think not to create a council of despair, but this is a very difficult thing to do. And so it's perhaps we should not be too hard on California if we're having difficulty. So I'm going to turn things over to Chris to talk about some of the challenges to performance management and measurement.
As Juliet has mentioned, none of these federal level initiatives and many of the state level initiatives have not been sustaining, have not been successful in the long run. And people in the literature point to a number of major reasons for that. One of them is that they misperceive the range of political constraints to this. One of them is that performance measure means that there's consensus on what are the goals we are trying to strive for, and if there is no consensus towards that, performance measurement actually runs into roadblocks. One, when we have a system of government that's based on the division of power and on the creation of checks and balances, that very structure of our government may be antithetical to types of management reforms that emphasize effectiveness and efficiency. Then there's a bureaucratic constraints. One of the problems is that people have pointed out is we create systems for managing for results, which start measuring things, but then we don't give people the discretion to actually change the processes that produce these results, and then that just leads to a level of frustration where they felt that they are accountable but do not have the sufficient the discretion to actually reach those goals. But we're going to focus in on something else, and that's just really what are the level of cognitive constraints in these systems of performance management. We don't have to look very hard. This is a depiction of the performance measurement system in one paper by Sol and Shiuma. And these systems are inordinately complicated, involving figuring out ways to measure processes, outputs, outcomes, gaining organizational consensus on what are all the goals on all these things. And so just creating the system is an enormously burdensome process. The people who write about this and are advocates and proponents of performance measurement will advocate usually a 3-year planning period to create a system of performance measurement.
That's before implementation, right? I mean,
right. Mm-hmm. So, and then we also argue that it really just has a very flawed conceptualization of public organizations. It really imagines that performance measurement is going to go work best if you have an organization that understands what it wants to achieve and understands the technology for achieving it. So there's consensus on goals, consensus on means. And those are the types of things that then you can fine-tune the processes for achieving those means. But in most public organizations, we do not necessarily have consensus on goals, and very frequently we only have a vague conceptualization of the means, of how our program outputs really lead to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve through a government organization. And so the point that, this brings us back to Wildofsky, and really the point that he's making is when you create a very intricate and complicated system to do it, does it really create a system that allows you to identify problems with the organization and fix those problems as you move forward? And his argument is that actually this gets in the way of problem solving because the system is so complicated. Now, the California story in performance reforms is no better, but possibly no worse than what we've had at the federal government. There have been numerous efforts at systemic reform, like that graph. The Wilson administration in the mid-1990s, after the budget crises that California experienced, tried a series of experiments with performance-based budgeting. And initially, they put a lot of effort into this, and they essentially failed. And then the LAO did a postmortem 5 years later and found that they could not identify a single improvement in program outcomes due to the performance-based budgeting exercise. Arnold Schwarzenegger came into office declaring that he was going to blow up the boxes of government and wanting to completely reform. And he did create a performance review that went statewide and did a review. But then right after that performance review was gone, his department, the chief of the Department of Finance changed, and all the headwinds stopped that process down. In the Brown administration, we've also had a stop-start effort where the legislature in 2011 unanimously passed, both the Assembly and the Senate passed SB 14, which required agencies in California to implement systems of performance management. Governor Brown vetoed it, saying that this was going to impose too great a burden on the small agencies. But then, in response to that, right after he promulgated an executive order, you know what? I copied over the wrong one because we had we even had the number of the executive order on our final one, which essentially says we are going to start doing some experiments on performance measurement, and a couple of those experiments have started this spring. Similarly, in response to kind of the inability of the state to move forward on these performance measures, California Forward, a nonprofit, put forward a performance measurement initiative on the 2012 ballot, and it failed. And
actually, with all our research on performance management, Chris and I both voted against it.
So, but what's very interesting, what's been going on in California is as all along where we've been having a continuous system of failed systemic reform in California, there's been a lot of departmental level. This is not even at the agency, but at the individual departments at the state level, administrators have been implementing performance measurement initiatives. The Little Hoover Commission, because it goes around and interviews this, started to recognize that there was all these pockets of innovation going around in the state. And so in 2009, they created the Performance Management Council. And Stu Drown, he calls it the therapy session, that he just wanted to have a place where these people could share their stories about what was working, what was not working, and how hard it was to get California state government to work this way. So, what we're doing is we're doing some case study analysis to really examine what happens when you have initiative from the middle. Most of the literature and most of the major initiatives in the government have been very much these systemic top-down efforts of creating a system frequently tied to budgeting decisions. Here we have a very different form of innovation. It's happening at the departmental level. It's not connected necessarily to strategic planning or to budgeting. So we're doing a number of case studies. We have 6 underway. We're all about in the midpoint of most of them. Some we haven't been able to get off the ground yet, though. And so basically we have, this is kind of a smart practice approach, that we're looking at what's the best case scenario. The cases where people are actually able to do this, are they able to really move this forward? Are they sustainable? What are the positive effects for their agencies? And there you have a list of the 6 cases that we're going after right now. And I think the overarching question of this is that if you read about performance measurement, you have this history of failure of systemic reform because of these political constraints, because of the cognitive constraints. And so I'm really interested in is this suggesting that there's a possibility of a different path, that going from the middle and building these reforms from the bottom up, is there some indication that there's some reason to think that you could succeed that way while the systemic reforms fail? So some of the specific questions that we're asking are, what are the factors that led to these performance measurement initiatives to arise? What processes are employed to develop measures? How have the measures been used? And what has really contributed to the utility of the performance measurement system and its sustainability? By the way, we haven't gotten a single question yet, which I think is bad form on the audience's part, and we would be happy to entertain any
questioning colleagues aren't here, so. Howard has a question.
Okay.
Now, I think you've already addressed this, but maybe
sorry.
a little bit more directly. Thinking about the complicated graph that you had from the student moment ago, it's not a more general question. How possible would it be to develop a set of objective, standardized, comparable measures from agency to agency regarding performance? Just thinking about the measurement issue itself, and under the assumption that you do want a metric that can be used for comparison among agencies.
That's what's failed so far.
Right. I think that when we get to the bottom line,
whether
I think
it can be done empirically, it suggests that we.
You're asking when you create a systemic form of performance management, and it starts from the top. Going down. Typically what it is, the main question that you're asking is, how do I figure out where my money should be going? Should it be going to DMV or to corrections? And then that instantly raises your apples to oranges questions. But how do you create metrics that actually inform you about the different goals between all those things? I think part of our argument and our interest in this is if you separate performance measurement from that interagency comparison problem, are you able to create a system that's still able to improve performance at the agency level while those systemic systems have kind of consistently failed in doing exactly that? So I think that is the main problem. That it if you take it away from budgeting, if you take it away from move it away from interagency comparisons, do you end up with a system that's useful, but doesn't just get shipwrecked on the shoals of these very difficult measurement problems? Dan.
Go back to where you were
before you went on, but just a small observation, which is you're looking at the Department of Transportation.
Go to the next one.
Previous one, well, that one, whatever, is one of your case studies, and I find it fascinating. I don't know if we ever talked about this actually, but I served 2 years on their performance measurement.
Okay.
You're on our interview list
then.
We're not done with that case, so you're going to be hearing from us.
And what I was going to say, aside from that comment, was it didn't start in the middle. It was a product of a failed Schwarzenegger statewide, blow up the boxes when Sonny McPeak, as the Secretary of Business, Transportation, and Housing, chose as a pilot an agency that she thought needed to be changed. It was performance, so it began with a visioning process, which I chaired, and then it went to the performance evaluation at the department level for 2 years. And I can regale you with all the wonderful stories of what did go on and what didn't, and what they tried to do and what they wouldn't do, and why I was kept on when I kept trying to walk off because they weren't listening and having an input and all that. But there were reasons for all those things, but it didn't start in the middle.
Okay, so
I want to come back to it. This was prompted by a leader, and I don't even know Sonny McPeak, but not a shy, unassuming person. She came in with both feet and said, this will become the Department of Mobility, not Transportation, and really had that vision in mind to transform mobility in California.
interesting that we heard a different story in our interviews at the departmental level.
Surprise, surprise.
So,
I was supported by Sonny, not by the department.
so
anyway, my only observation, point was, it's hard to imagine radical change taking place, for instance, in the Secretariat at a department level without it having some leadership direction.
Well, that's where we're going, but I think our question is not whether it will be radical.
We went from Department of Mobility to performance management. I mean, it already came down to, all right, what are the nuts and bolts? And that had its own pros and cons.
I think Dan is right in the sense that to change the way that staff is going to be evaluated is going to require some higher authorization. You're not going to be able to just say, okay, I'm going off the grid for my portion of a larger organization to assess and evaluate staff, because that will either get you or the rest of the organization in trouble. and you'll need that kind of sign off. So I'm not saying, actually I probably am, I'm going to amend it a little bit to say that I don't know that any of this stuff could be in the middle that way, but what's important to understand is the relationship between this and so the consent that is given by higher levels.
Well, this may be partly a California-specific thing, but in the Caltrans example, we're not finished with that case, and so you could quite be right. This is a work in progress. But I will tell you that the Water Resources Control Boards, which are under the agency EPA, I think it's Cal EPA. Cal EPA has nothing to do with this. They're doing this on their own, essentially. It does have leadership. We're not saying leadership doesn't matter, but we're saying, at least if you think about this, that, yeah, I mean, so I think the question is really, do you have to have this kind of really systemically across the board reform effort, or can you have disjointed incrementalism that can nonetheless make management improvements? And it may be a California-specific thing. It may not be generalizable to the federal level.
So I actually think what you just said is interesting, because I don't know how any of these organizations are run, but to the extent that the water control boards operate to some extent with some autonomy, where Cal EPA is not sort of managing them that closely, they may have that kind of authority. So you may actually see differences just in terms of as a function of the organizational institutional structures, and that's interesting as well. I mean, that's very interesting.
Well, and it also speaks to the issue with doing case analysis, because it may not be generalizable.
Right.
But I mean, we have to at some point talk about our cases, because I think.
Yeah, I think now we have about 1500 minutes.
Okay,
But,
so
yeah,
one more question.
I think the interesting thing is that we also want to distinguish about how the leadership for the initiative, because I think that very often that there's a leadership initiative, you should be doing something and validating that. And then there's the question of what is the purpose of creating this performance measurement. And if it's for making budgetary decisions in the governor's office versus management decisions at the departmental level, that's the real distinguisher. I think that you will see that most of our cases, there is relatively high-level leadership. In fact, Sonny McPete was involved not only in Caltrans, but in lots of other areas where her name comes up as a real advocate of performance management. So she played a big role, but the design and implementation, though, was more departmental level. Okay. So these, and I think one of the things is that, these are selected cases, so this is certainly not a random sample, but we're trying to get a selection that differentiate the complexity of their mission, the measurability of their mission, and the size of the agency. So let's going to talk very quickly about a couple of cases that we have. And the first one is the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which has relatively recently been renamed that. And some of the more important things about that is that if you look at this, and shame on me, I used Wikipedia, but it is good data, that the prison population has skyrocketed in the last 20-some years in California, and that has also led that the size of the California budget being spent on prisons has also been skyrocketing. So there's a lot of pressure because of that on the California prison system because it was demanding so much funds. And it was also a system that had a lot of management woes, whereas now it's trying to get out of a consent decree that was imposed by the federal government because of overcrowding and inadequate health care. So it was perceived as a system in crisis. And so partly this, the system of performance measurement came from very on high. It was Governor Schwarzenegger started telling CDCR, you need to change your ways, and one of the ways you need to change your management practices. So one of the things that he did force them is to undertake a strategic planning process, and they went through that strategic planning process for a couple of years. And during that process, during that time, CompStat was getting a lot of press, and so the main idea was just this, the diffusion of policy ideas, and they start thinking of just completely adopting in a straightforward manner the CompStat model from LAPD, and they started discussing with Bratton and his team. And in addition to that, they really did have an executive team at CDCR who were quite supportive of the concept of performance management at its initiation in 2006. But very quickly it ran into a number of problems. The most important one is that it was trying to measure a lot of process variables and output variables of prisons, but every single prison had a completely different accounting system, and most of these accounting systems were not electronic. And so they were getting a massive information on paper every single year and trying to hold meetings where they were making these comparisons and trying to track results. And most of the discussion was being focused around the quality of the data, that you can't criticize me for that, because the reason those numbers got high is for X, Y, and Z reasons, not because of any underlying problem. The other issue that really bedeviled this was that there was an underlying disagreement about what the goal of the Department of CDCR's goal was. There's one main camp that really believes in incarceration. We take criminals, we remove them from society, thereby making society safer, and that's our most important function. Then the other camp is really much more focused on rehabilitation, focusing in on how are we going to get these people to go back into society and operate as good, if not great citizens. And an important problem with this, that you saw that this primary issue, is that if you think about the translation of CompStat, what CompStat does so well is it takes crime statistics and it analyzes them on a weekly basis, and then it targets resources whenever you have a flare-up of crime in a certain area. So what's the analog to crime for a prison system? And I think the analog, the original analog of crime, was recidivism. It's like people who, they do their time, they go back into society. If you've succeeded, they'll stay out of prison. And then you really want to target that recidivism rate. But that recidivism rate, even though it was very prominent in the strategic planning process, it kind of just got focused away once they started actually coming up with their performance measures, and their performance measures really didn't include any direct measures of recidivism. But there were some success factors in this. It wasn't a complete failure. After having very many problems with data quality and availability, they did a major revamp of the process, which turned it all electronic. So now they were starting to get good data, and they had a series of meetings where they could have an agreement on what were the right how to measure all of these initiatives. Then they had a system where they were actually able to start comparing prison from prison and comparing prisons over time and making management assessments. An interesting thing about this is the way that they designed all these performance measures is that they did not do the prototypical performance measurement where you start with your strategic plan, you come up with your objectives, and then you create your measures. When they started doing this, they went around onto the management level and asked people, what information do you have? What information do you need? And then they built up from the bottom up on building from data that already existed. Then they basically started using that data in their CompStat meetings and recording what was going on, and so that they were able to have a record of what was doing. So that there was some real success in using this information to improve the operations of prisons. So to address problems with suicide rates or with inadequate medical care. But it was really very much an operations-based function. And then the question was whether more recently they've made some efforts to expand this between just looking at operations and thinking of this much more as a comparative exercise in management, figuring out how to improve the overall operations of the prisons. And it's been this transition into the management where the political resistance increased very greatly, and a lot of the innovation in CompStat stalled. So let me go.
Going to go on. So that's one case. The other case where Dan also knows more about the background than I do is the State Water Resources Control Board, which has been, again, recognized as being very innovative in working on trying to improve performance measurement within its organization specifically. It's moderately complex because it actually is a state board that sets policy and establishes water rights, but then the actual development of the plans that govern the permitting process and monitoring of quality enforcement are at the level of 9 regional boards. Those are their boundaries in the illustration. And it's also complex because they permit and monitor water discharges from a really wide array of government and private sources, everything from Caltrans to scrap metal recycling facilities, which I learned is actually a major source of pollution. I did not know that before. And they have a large number of programs for a relatively small agency, 1,600 people. About 700 work at the state board level, and there are about 900 at the field. So this is a similar, it's interesting because it really is operating within EPA on its own. They've briefed EPA. EPA doesn't seem so interested. They've tried to get other agencies on board with what they're doing, and it's very siloed. It's kind of interestingly siloed, and I think it may actually have to do with the structure of California government and the way the influence of the cabinet secretaries. It also came from pressure. Actually, in 2002, part of the budget crisis, they moved from largely general fund support of the department to actually fee funding. So 82% of their activities now are paid for by fees from regulated industries. And so those folks started complaining about whether or not they were efficient, complaining about compliance costs, complaining about permitting delays, and the resentment, a lot of political resentment and backlash, because it was kind of an insult to injury. Not only were they perceived not to do a good job, but they were paying for it. And so that was around 4 years later, Tam Dudok was a new board chair who was appointed by the Schwarzenegger administration, and she was kind of a leader, the right leader at the right time. She has an MBA in business and a civil engineering degree, so she understands both systems and organizations. And she could talk to both, she could think about management and talk to the engineers that are essentially populate the department. So and she had past experience in the department. The primary issue that they faced was essentially that they were trying to figure out what the regional boards were doing, and the regional boards were not wanting to cooperate with essentially establishing targets or measures, and so they got a lot of regional resistance throughout the state. And I think that this is a case where they actually did a really interesting sort of workaround, which is that, first of all, they brought in departmental management from outside of the agency at the top level. And so there's a history in the department of promoting from within, so you end up with lots of engineers or people who have worked in this agency for a long time and may not be actually on board with trying to do evidence-based management. But then the real interesting thing is that they kept trying to develop targets or measures of activities, and they were getting so much resistance. They brought in all their regional managers and trained them, and there was just endless resistance. And so finally, they have a talented data manager in a very small data shop. He decided that what they would do is start off by just figuring out what people were doing and measuring that. And that's how they actually essentially negotiated performance targets. And this gets to the kind of Howard's question, 9 different sets of performance targets that were decentralized and negotiated with the individual regional water boards. This is the kind of thing that would drive this sort of like classic strategic management focused performance management crazy, because you have no way of actually knowing whether you're measuring the right thing. But her attitude was, I have to start measuring something. I'm going to then overcome the resistance, political resistance, and I'm then going to improve it. And actually, she's still on the board. She's no longer the chair. And so they actually were adding, you can see that their performance measures here, and I don't have time. I have a cool hyperlink that I don't have time to use. But they have a they have a lot of performance measures that tend to be around enforcement activities and permitting and compliance and what we think of as process, not outcome measures. And only in the last couple of years are they starting to actually add outcome measures about units of pollutants reduced and wetland beach stream miles cleaned. And so they are actually trying to get to the point of measuring outcomes of their activities. But what you notice here that's interesting, in contrast to the sort of classic literature where you have to develop your strategic plan and then derive your measures from that and then go out and collect the data, they started with their measures. So they did it almost in a backward mapping kind of way, and then they've essentially worked through this public reporting and evaluation, working with the measures, and then adjusting their program. And that's not just their management program, but also adjusting and continually developing their performance measurement system. And so, as I said, now, and the really interesting thing is that she has been the management team, including Tam, who's still on the board, has been moving towards trying to think how they can eventually attach this back to resources and budgeting. And so what they're in the process of now, because argument is, we are collecting fees. Those fees may not actually be attached to our priority areas from a standpoint of cleanup. And so what she's doing now is they did a big realignment report in 2011, 2012, where they looked at where they were spending their fees. And now what she's doing is actually engaging her stakeholders, by which I mean permit holders, and some of their most high priority budget processes to get them to comment on their realignment report and provide input on what should be the priority areas. It's interestingly, they have not actually brought the entire environmental advocacy groups in at this point. It's all essentially regulated industry. So these are water discharge agencies of various sorts. And her view is that if she brings the stakeholders in, can work with them to develop priority areas, that the state water board can then start thinking about linking at that point resources back to priorities and essentially close the loop. They're in the middle of it, actually. They're going to be having a meeting in a couple of weeks where these 4 teams that they have working on it come and talk about this. Now, interestingly, we did interview one of the stakeholders who, of course, thought that they should not be measuring any of these things, that what they should be measuring is compliance cost, which they do not measure now. So it will be interesting to see what happens when you actually involve stakeholders in trying to speak to, at least a select group of stakeholders, in trying to speak to this kind of reform. And it almost gets to Raphael's point, because she recognizes that to some extent there may be a need to go seek legislative approval at some point to make changes, because they can't work in a vacuum. But her point is, if I'm going to do that, I want the regulated industries on board, because they are going to help give me political, or us, the State Water Board, political support for making the kinds of changes if we need legislative authority or if we need to go higher up the ladder. It's a very, very backward mapping, bottom up, but really strategically driven approach that is in fact completely detached from upper level management. They're pretty much, she briefs them on it, but she said that they don't really pay attention, and she's trying to get the other water agency, Toxic Substances Control, on board and doing some joint reporting, and they are struggling with their own performance management. I think we're arguing that these are sort of disjointed performance management efforts, in particular because they're decoupled operationally from strategic planning. Even in the case of Caltrans, they didn't talk about Sunny McPee's strategic plan. They were talking about strategic planning going back 15 years. I mean, they've had strategic plan after strategic plan, and then they went out and found things that they could measure. And so I think that and granted, you have to have leadership, but at least in California, and it may be specific to California, maybe not at the agency level, and maybe you need to be a little bit more siloed in how you start with this and then build up. if that's possible. It's very incremental in the sense that in all of the cases that we looked at so far, and actually this is what you will hear from people also that have been successful in some of the CompStat applications, they're built on existing data. So the data are imperfect, but there. And so that you can at least start measuring what you're doing and then feeding that back in, and that's essentially how you can overcome departmental resistance as people start learning that actually measuring what they're doing doesn't necessarily turn into an attack, which is usually the lower level.
Let me make one point here. The other part about this, about using data that's existing, there's been very much a focus on coming up with measures that are instantly usable by managers, so that
that's my second slide. So you have to wait. Sorry, I can do that because we're married.
I created that slide, so that's
yes, I know. You can speak to it if you want when I get to it. Leadership. We can talk about the leadership issue, and I think that's a really interesting point, and want to talk to both Raphael and Dan about that, because that's essentially, to me, not necessarily as essential as the fact that you may try. It may need to be incrementalist, and then this idea that it has been more effective when it's essentially shown to managers to be utility. We have some examples of improvements that they've made, but they're actually smaller scale improvements. It's not massive reform of government. And there are issues around institutionalization. Here's Chris's point. You want to speak to this?
Okay. I guess
You
so.
did make the chart, so I was going to speak to it.
Bob Bain, one of the premier performance management scholars, he, in a 2003 paper, he just said, look, there's lots of different reasons that you may want to measure performance. And so then you have to focus a little bit on what your goals are with the performance measurement system to see what you will measure. Now, we've adapted this a little bit. That, to me, what was interesting about him, that they come from things that are relatively low stakes. That means that it's not going to change people's jobs very much, or their allocation of resources. And where's the locus of control? Who's using the information? And I've just kind of stacked this up from, you can do this just to learn what's going on in your organization, to celebrate, reward employees for high performance, promoting yourself. This is actually something that's been very important in California, that you go out to your stakeholders and you tell them, and you have the information now to tell them what you are doing. And that's been one of the more successful ones. Then you can do some process improvements using this information. Then you can try to control some parts of the agencies, evaluate what you're doing. Then there become these more allocative decisions, which are higher stakes. I think one of the things that you see what's going on in California is that there's been a lot of efforts to use performance measurement to learn, celebrate, and promote and improve the process in these organizations. So they've stayed very much on the lower level of the uses, the ones that are less politically politically contentious. Now, so that has been an advantage, and has been one of these things that have allowed these programs to survive and to develop, even though there hasn't been systemic political support for them. One of the things that we're beginning to see that is that in a lot of the agencies, they begin to push this, to go from control to evaluating their program and using them in allocative decisions, and that's very much a point where things get contentious. And so an interesting question looking forward, we don't have the answer now, is that if the same pathologies of the systemic reforms reappear once you start pushing these disjointed and incremental reforms to a greater end.
And one slightly anticlimactic footnote, there is currently a small performance budgeting initiative pilot program that was the Department of Finance's response essentially to the governor's executive order. And they are doing performance budgeting initiatives mostly in departments that have been doing performance measurement because they can get the data. So again, it's a question of like how far can you get with this sort of incremental reform. So that's it.
Question, we can have time for a couple of questions.
This sounds also like a demand attenuation problem. You have these two cases. In the second case where there was this improved performance, well, you could identify the people demanding the service and they were paying the fees. Versus in the prison system where the demand is diffused, the fees sort of work their way through the state government. improvement. So there's no demand discipline, and that influence is very much attenuated versus the water resources.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Across several of the cases.
See, this is, now you're getting at the questions that we started with that we may get back to, which is, you know, where do you see, what kinds of agency characteristics seem to lead to different kinds of approaches and different levels of success? But I think that's a really interesting point.
You might not need to dictate what the performance standards need to be or what the policy needs to be, because as long as the demand is there for the improvement, different groups will innovate to respond to the demand.
Right. Other comments? Dan?
I'm with Howard, systematic across agencies. My only reservation is that it may be at 100,000 feet, and so you don't get the granulation you get when you look within the agency, because again, that's one thing. And the other is this link I mentioned earlier between organizational change, which comes from a visioning process, presumably, and performance management, which typically finds itself embedded within an entity about what it's currently doing. So your improved outcomes there is more like a visioning, consequence of visioning. And yeah, that's real hard to change. We'll talk about the Department of Transportation, but their performance, I don't know what you heard from anybody, but it sure helped the department director manage his staff.
Right. Well, and they actually helped them get federal funding because they were able to show that they could.
But that didn't get to the improved outcomes. That's just, we'll talk about it.
Right. I think that we're not there yet, but a possible kind of a summation of this is that a problem with the existing performance management is it strives for the perfect and therefore stomps on the good.
Literature. We're talking about the literature.
So it's these systemic reforms that try to come up with things that you can compare between departments, ends up creating measures that aren't even useful for their intended audience. But here what we have in California, that there's some efforts that even though they're imperfect and you can only do so much with them, that it's a process that is able to identify things that you can measure, and then you can make reasonable management decisions based on that information, even if it is not the grand level visioning exercise.
So
Okay.
I wonder to what extent these kind of practices, to what extent they were able to link to tangible incentive, either reward and punishment for the individuals involved in the process.
They have had tremendous difficulty in linking these down to the level of human resources management. And actually, it's interesting because that, in fact, is where the State Water Resources Control Board wants to go. They are, in fact, have figured out how personnel hours are attached to particular kinds of tasks, and they're trying to come up with some comparable efficiency measures, not across the state, but across the different regional control boards. But first of all, the civil service system makes it extremely difficult to do any kind of incentive-based work on this, and then add in the employees' unions, and it's tough. But the one, and this is just, of course, an example, but one thing that they did cite as a very specific kind of managerial, staff-level management reform is that they had one regional board that was just processing many more permits much more quickly than the others, and they were able to sort of diffuse their particular practices across the other boards so that they could try and also use some of these kinds of management techniques that were essentially creating greater efficiency. But I have not seen a case where they're tying it back to individual.
In CDCR, they do it, and that wardens become accountable for their statistics. And so when wardens are nominated as wardens, they are placed there on a one-year probation, and then the inspector general has to nominate them for a permanent placement. And that nomination goes back to their comp stat statistics. An issue, though, is that how far you're able to do it, because they have never brought in all these issues about recidivism And so this review is very much determined on operational
It's like based on
interest of-
violence reduction and things
violence
like that.
reduction and completion of programs, basic outputs
But is it
in
like
the system.
tenure? Once you get your appointment, you don't have to actually.
No, nothing's like tenure.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time.
Okay.
Thank you for
Thank you.
excellent presentation.